Hey Goblin, you've been really practicing those war drums.
I'll bring the generic Goblin noise!
This video is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc. with free weekly content and free shipping on orders over $150. You can save 5% site-wide by using the promo code MTGMudsta. If you're looking for a direct way to help the channel, please consider joining my Patreon and becoming a member of the Generic Goblin Gang. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today's game is exciting because it sees the return of Chris and Reese, two great players who I met at a local game store. In today's game, Chris is playing his Samut deck, keeping Cultivate, Xenagos God of Revels, a Forest, 2 Plains, Jetmir's Garden, and Kamal Heart of Krosa. Reese is playing his Yasharn deck, keeping a Plains, Swords to Plowshares, 2 Forests, 3 Visits, Nissa Vital Force, and Ghostway. Eric is playing his Tom Bombadil deck, keeping Zeator's Proving Grounds, Mountain, Forest, Chromatic Lantern, Sithis Harvest Hand, The Bath Song, and 3 Visits. I am playing Halana and Alena, keeping a Wooded Ridgeline, Beast Within, Mindless Automaton, Temple of Abandon, Forest, Oran Wreath of Vastwood, and Inspiring Call. Chris wins the die roll and starts us off. He plays a tapped Jetmir's Garden. Eric follows his example, playing a Zeator's Proving Ground, which comes in tapped. I don't want to break from the mold, as I play a tapped Temple of Abandon, scrying 1 and keeping it on top. Reese decides to break from the mold, playing a Plains and passing. Chris plays a Plains and passes. Eric's got a Mountain for turn and casts 3 Visits. I play another tap land with a Wooded Ridgeline and pass. Reese plays a Forest for turn and casts his own copy of 3 Visits, passing while searching. Chris has a Forest for turn and casts Cultivate, finding a tap basic for the field and 1 for his hand. Eric plays a Forest and then casts Chromatic Lantern. He still has enough for Sithis and passes after that. I continue to play tap lands with an Oran Reef, and then pay 2 mana for Roaring Earth. Reese draws, plays a Plains, and casts Skyshroud Claim to go and find 2 more forests. Chris has a Plains for turn, and then casts a Farseek. Once he's done that, he plays out Fabro Elder, passing. Eric casts the Weatherseed Treaty, starting on the first chapter for a basic land, not to mention drawing a card and gaining a life from Sithis. He then plays a Zagoth Triome, and once that's out, plays Starfield Mystic, passing to me. I draw and cast Wood Elves, going to find a Stomping Grounds, and also play a Highland Forest. This triggers the Roaring Earth twice, and I put 2+1/+1 counters onto my Wood Elves and pass. Reese has a Forest for turn, and casts his commander, Yasharn, going to find a Plains and a Forest to put to hand. Chris draws and plays a Forest. He casts Samut, and then taps the Fabro Elder for 3 colors to cast a Somberwald Sage. He follows up by tapping the Sage since it has haste and a Plains to help cast Audric, Lunarch Marshal. He goes to combat swinging Samut and Audric at Eric, who takes the hit, and Chris passes. Eric draws, making a Saproling token from the Weatherseed Treaty. He then plays Elspeth Conquers Death to exile Audric, and follows that up with the Bath Song, drawing 2 and discarding 1. He then plays a Birds of Paradise, passing to me. I play a Fertilid for turn, and then drop a Forest and get to put another +1/+1 counter onto it thanks to Roaring Earth. I then go to combat, swinging my 3/3 Wood Elves at Eric, and pass turn. Reese draws and plays a Plains. He then plays out the Great Henge and passes after that. Chris taps his Mana Dorks to help cast Kamal Heart of Krosa. He then plays Xenagos God of Revels, but this has Reese responding by casting Swords to Plowshares and targets Kamal. Going to combat, Chris then puts the Xenagos trigger onto Samut and swings her at Reese. Reese blocks with Yasharn, and before moving to damage, casts Ghostway to flicker Yasharn. After that, Chris passes, and during his end step, Yasharn returns, getting Reese 2 more basics, and he gets to draw a card from the Great Henge. Eric draws and gives his Starfield Mystic +5/+5 from the Weatherseed Treaty, and then adds another counter to Elspeth Conquers Death to add to its tax mode, and then draws 2 and discards 1 from the Bath Song. He then plays Ren the Realmbreaker and upticks it but with no target. He then casts Birth of the Imperium and gets 3 Astartes Warrior tokens. He follows that up by casting Azusa's Many Journeys and then passes. During his end step, I activate Fertilid to find a mountain and put a +1/+1 counter back onto it thanks to Roaring Earth. I draw and play Halana and Alena. I then move to combat, putting all their counters onto Fertilid, but with nothing else, pass. Rhys has a forest for turn, and then plays Nissa Vital Force, and upticks it to animate a forest. Going to combat, he swings the forest at Ren, and Eric chumps one of the Astartes warriors, and with nothing else, Rhys passes. Chris draws and casts Elemental Bond, which in turn animates Xenagos since he has Devotion. He then plays Shalai, drawing a card from the Elemental Bond, and then casts Birds of Paradise after that. Moving to combat, Chris puts the Xenagos trigger onto Samut, and then everything but Samut goes at Ren, which Eric in turn blocks with the Birds of Paradise and his tokens. With nothing else, Chris passes. Eric draws and animates the Birds of Paradise with Elspeth Conquers Death. He then shuffles some cards in and adds 2 blue from the Bath Song, and then upticks Azusa's Many Journeys and Birth of the Imperium, which has us sacrificing a creature. Once he's done that, he then casts Tom Bombadil, and I respond by casting Beast Within and targeting Sithis. Eric then upticks Ren, but with no target, and then casts Phyrexian Scriptures, putting the +1/+1 counter onto the Starfield Mystic, and making it an artifact in addition to its other types. After that, Eric passes to me. I draw and cast Mindless Automaton, and then go to combat. I get my Halana and Alena trigger on it, and I get to add 2 more +1/+1 counters to it, but decide not to attack. I then remove the 2 counters in my second main phase to draw a card. I then drop a Rockfell Veil, and then put a +1/+1 counter onto Halana and Alena from Roaring Earth, and pass. Rhys draws and ultimates Nissa, and then plays a forest to draw a card. He then plays Eternal Witness, which returns Ghostway to his hand, and draws him a card from the Great Henge. He then casts a Green Sun Zenith, putting 3 into the X, and goes to find Reclamation Sage, blowing up the Phyrexian Scriptures. Rhys then follows up with Selesnya Signet, and at this point I remember to count up his Great Henge activations to add to his life total, and with nothing else, Rhys passes. Chris draws and plays a forest. He then activates Shalai to pump up his team with a +1/+1 counter, and moves to combat. He swings Shalai at Ren, and Samut at me, and Xenagos at Rhys, after giving the Xenagos trigger to Shalai. Eric jumps with his bird tokens, and I block with the Mindless Automaton, and Rhys blocks with the Yasharn. I then remove the 2 counters to draw a card from the Automaton after having successfully blocked, and Rhys casts Ghostway again before moving to combat damage. With his combat step basically fogged, Chris then casts Kamadama's Reach in his second main phase, and he passes to his end step. This has Rhys' commander returning, finding him 2 more lands, and getting to return Ghostway to his hand as the Eternal Witness comes in, plus destroys the Elemental Bond from the Reclamation Sage. Eric draws and flips Azusa's Many Journeys, and then flips into Eldest Reborn thanks to Tom Bombadil's trigger. I respond by casting Inspiring Call to draw 2, and I then sacrifice Halana and Alena, while Rhys sacrifices Yasharn, and Chris sacrifices the Somberwald Sage. The Birth of Imperium then resolves, and Eric draws 6 more cards. He then plays Hall of Heliod's Generosity, and casts his own Fabro Elder. He then plays an Argothian Enchantress, and Eric wraps things up by upticking Ren again, and then casting 3 Visits and Farseek, and passing. I draw, and play out Invigorating Hot Springs. I then play out a Doomscar Warrior, and back up on the Fertilid. I then remove a counter from the Hot Springs to put one onto the Doomscar Warrior, and I then play a Forest for turn, and get to put another counter onto the Warrior thanks to Roaring Earth. Going to combat, I swing my team at Eric, and he blocks the Fertilid with the Starfield Mystic. I then activate the Fertilid to get a land before it dies, and then put another +1/+1 counter onto the warrior thanks to the Roaring Earth. Eric then takes a total hit of 7, and I get to reveal off the top thanks to my warrior trigger, showing a Port Razor and putting it to my hand and passing. Rhys draws and plays a forest again, drawing as it enters. He then plays Reshape the Earth to go and find 10 lands, and gets to draw 10 cards from Nisa's emblem. He follows up by casting a Soul Ring and then a Feldar Retreat, and he moves to discard, passing after that. Chris draws and plays a Plains. He then plays Elvish Mystic. Sadly with nothing in hand, he then activates Shalai twice to pump the team, and goes to combat. He puts a Xenagos trigger onto Samut, and swings her and Shalai at Eric, and the Elvish Mystic at Rhys. Eric chumps Shalai with the birds, and chumps Samut with the Likeness of the Seer, while Rhys takes the full 3. With nothing else, Chris passes. Eric activates Hall of Heliod's Generosity on his upkeep to put Elspeth Conquers Death on top of his library, and then draws it for turn. He then ticks up the Eldest Reborn, and we each discard a card. And Eric then plays a Plains for turn, and recasts Elspeth Conquers Death. As it comes in, it exiles Shalai, and Eric then goes to combat. He swings his Fabro Elder at Rhys for 5, who takes the hit. And in Eric's post-combat main phase, he casts a Citizen Champion. And then here and back again. He gets to draw from the Enchantress effects, and then chooses Samut to be unable to block from here and back again. He then plays Binding of the Old Gods. This has Eric targeting the Rex Sage with the Binding, and once that's done, he upticks Ren and passes to me. I draw and play a Mountain. I then play Tavern Brawler and recast Halana and Alena, activating the Oran Reef once they're out to give them a +1/+1 counter. I then activate the Invigorating Hot Springs to give them another one. Going to combat, I put 4 +1/+1 counters onto the Doomscar Warrior and swing it at Rhys. Rhys takes the hit, and I reveal a Voldaren Thrillseeker from the trigger, and after that, I pass. Rhys draws and once more casts Green Sun Zenith again, putting 7 into the X, and going to find Avenger of Zendikar. With it coming in, he makes 20 plant tokens. And then he plays a Findhorn Elves. He plays a land for turn with an Exotic Orchard, drawing a card, making a cat token, and giving all of his plant tokens a +1/+1 counter. He then plays Cultivate and gets even more landfall triggers. After that, he recasts Yasharn to go and find 2 more basics to his hand, and passes to Chris. Chris draws and plays Aurelia the War Leader, and then goes straight to combat. He puts the Xenagos trigger onto Aurelia, and swings it all at Rhys, except for the Fabro Elder, which goes at me. Rhys chumps the 2 ground creatures with his cat tokens, but takes 6 from Aurelia on the first combat step, and we then move to Chris's next combat step. Chris makes the same attacks again, and pumps Aurelia once more with Xenagos. Before moving to blocks, Rhys flashes an Endurance and puts his graveyard on the bottom of his deck, and thankfully chumps Aurelia since it has reach, and he blocks the other ground creatures with plant tokens. After that, Chris passes. During his upkeep, Eric casts Generous Gift and targets the Avenger of Zendikar, but Rhys responds with Cloud Shift to blink it. The Avenger then re-enters and makes another 22 plant tokens. Eric then draws for turn and ticks up his Saga. He gets to find a mountain and a forest to put into play tapped, and as he ticks up Elspeth Conquers Death, adds the tax to all of our non-creature spells, and then finishes the Eldest Reborn to reanimate a creature but somehow forgets it. Tom Bombadil triggers because of this though, and flips into the Kami War, which as it enters, finally exiles the Avenger of Zendikar. Eric then downticks Ren and brings back Hitsugu Consumes All, which he casts and wipes away all the plants. He then follows up by casting Elish Norn, and then Goldberry, and then a Noble Hierarch, and then Jin-Gitaxias. He wraps it up with Enchantress's Presence, and then goes to combat. He swings the Starfield Mystic at Rhys, who chumps with Eternal Witness, and Eric then passes. I exile a land to Tavern Brawler on my upkeep, and then draw. I play a Forest, and put a +1/+1 counter onto my commander. And then play the Port Raiser. And then an Aki Battle Squad, putting counters onto both of them with the Hot Springs. Going to combat, I put 5 counters onto the Doomscar Warrior, and swing it and the Port Raiser at Reese, with the Aki Battle Squad going at Chris. Everyone declares no blocks, and I move to my second combat step, putting 5 more counters onto the Warrior. I then swing everything except for Halana and Alena at Eric, and he blocks the Port Raiser and the Battle Squad, and everything else goes in front of the Doomscar Warrior. And I drop to 18 after resolving all the Yasharn triggers from my creatures attacking Eric. Reese draws and plays his own copy of Kamal Heart of Krosa, and then casts Tragic Arrogance. Eric keeps Ren, Goldberry, Binding the Old Gods, and Chromatic Lantern, while I keep an Aki Battle Squad and Tavern Brawler. Reese keeps Kamal, the Great Henge, and the Feldar Retreat. He then animates 3 lands with Kamal, and goes to combat. Kamal buffs the team, and Reese swings the lands at Eric for 12. Eric takes the hit, and Reese passes. Chris draws and plays a Forest. He then replays Samut and goes to combat, putting the Xenagos trigger on her. He then hits me for 12 with his commander, and passes to Eric. Eric untaps, and on his upkeep, puts the Kami War on top, and then takes a counter off Binding the Old Gods with Goldberry, and draws for turn. Eric then plays Yavimaya, and uptakes Ren to animate a mountain. He then plays the Kami War again, exiling Xenagos. And then plays Herald of the Pantheon, a Mesa Enchantress, and a Satyr Enchantress. Eric then goes to combat, hitting me for 3 with his land, and he passes after that. I draw and play an Opal Palace, and then play Hardened Scales and follow up with a Dust Shell Crawler. I put a +1/+1 counter onto the Aki Battle Squad, and I then cast my own Xenagos and go to combat. I put the Xenagos trigger onto the Aki Battle Squad and swing it at Reese for 28, which in turn takes him out, and I then move to my second combat step. I once more put the Xenagos trigger onto it, and I go at Chris with a 56/56 who has Trample, who also dies. I then move to my post-combat main phase, and I cast Voldaren Thrillseeker, which I have backup on the Aki Battle Squad, and I then pay the 1 to fling it at Eric's face for 56 damage, and win the game. Game review time. This game was 1 hour, 57 minutes, and 4 seconds, and 1 hour and 30 minutes of it was Eric resolving Saga main phase triggers. I'm only half kidding because it was pretty cool to see, and he actually got to use Tom Bombadil finally, and actually get a trigger or 2 off of him. But Sagas have so much going on, and there were so many decisions, it felt like his turns took twice as long as everyone else's. I think I got particularly lucky with those Doomscar Warrior triggers, as it allowed me to dig pretty deep into my deck and find some valuable cards, like that Voldaren Thrillseeker, which honestly is strongly becoming one of my favorite cards in the deck. It helps me pump up my creatures, and it gives them a valuable fling effect, which I don't run a lot of actually. Reese said this was the best his Yasharn deck has ever done, and he had so many lands. It was actually kind of disappointing to see him lose his Avenger Zendikar, because I thought we were all just dead to plant tokens. Chris, on the other hand, was a bit disappointed by his lack of draw. He lost that Elemental Bond, I think, after only drawing 1 card, which is a bit of a bummer, and for most of the late game, he actually had no cards in hand, which is brutal. This video wouldn't be possible without the help from my sponsors, Cool Stuff Inc., Multizone, Original Magic Art, and Alter Sleeves. But it definitely wouldn't be possible without the help from you, the viewers, and my patrons. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and to remember, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.